And I'm from the South London SWP, and I'll be chairing today's meeting. Joseph Choonara will be doing the meeting, doing the talk. It will be about 35 minutes, and there'll be use of slides. And I think the whole meeting is likely to be videoed. So if people, when we come to discussion, don't want to be videoed, just let one of us know, and that won't happen. Joseph, as I said, will talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we're going to do something a little bit new. Folks will just be talking to each other, whoever's sitting next to you, for about 3 minutes. So it's really just an icebreaker. Then we'll do what we normally do, which is have discussion, and what we ask is that people stick to 3 minutes, and I will, when 2 minutes is up, 2 minutes are up, you've got 1 minute left. I'm going to tap on this mic, okay? So with the 3 minutes, it just means that more people get to talk. And then after that, there's going to be a roaming mic, so don't worry. If you identify yourself, and I'll introduce 2 people at a time. Then finally, there will be feedback from Joseph, about 10 minutes, and he will address people's questions, thoughts, etc. I've done everything. Okay. So I'll leave it to Joseph. The other thing is that there are books available. There's 2 books which he's written, and they will be available, a couple here, but also bookmarks. Okay? So without further ado, Joseph.
Can people hear me? Yeah. Well, I'm going to speak very, very softly. This isn't because I found some new inner balance and tranquility. I think you think that I just got a really bad throat infection, so I have to be quite careful. Now, what I'm going to try and do in this meeting is I'm going to try and answer the question of whether there's a Marxist theory of crisis. I'm not really going to try and answer the very, very interesting question of did Marx have a theory of crisis. If you want to know the answer to that question, I strongly recommend, not just because he's in the room, reading the chaplain Alex Klinikos's book where he goes through this in quite a lot of detail. I'm not looking so much at specifically what Marx wrote about crisis, though I will be drawing on, of course, what Marx wrote about crisis. I'm going to be looking at whether we can construct some kind of coherent Marxist theory that can explain crisis, the crisis of capitalism, or the various crises of capitalism, in a general way, or can tell us something generally about how the system goes into crisis. Now, obviously, I wouldn't try to do that if I didn't think that you could do this, but it's not easy. There's a quote, I think, from Churchill where he says if you put 2 economists in a room, you get 2 opinions, unless one of them is John Maynard Keynes, in which case you get 3 opinions. You could equally say about Marxist economists, pretty much every Marxist writing about crisis has their own slightly distinctive theory of crisis. There are big divisions between Marxists, but even among those Marxists who share a general approach, there are fine distinctions, arguments, and so on. Anyone who's been to a conference of Marxist economists will have experience of hearing a couple of people speak together at a panel and agree and present a common message, and then in the bar afterwards they'll sort of sidle up to you and say, well, I don't really agree with him about that. There are huge rows and disagreements around this. Again, I'm not going to deal with every different position formulated by a Marxist on crisis. There's simply too many out there, too distinctive, and it will take too long to go through them all. Instead, what I'm going to try and do is present my own approach to the Marxist theory of crisis, drawing heavily on particular Marxist thinkers. So that's what I'm going to try and do in the next 30 or so minutes. Now, first of all, what do we mean by crisis? A crisis under capitalism is pretty much by definition a breakdown in what Marx called the circuit of capital. I have a little slide illustrating this. But you have this idea that under capitalism, money, capital in the form of money is advanced. It's used to purchase machinery, means of production, computers and so on, raw materials, and it's used to purchase or hire, in fact, labour power. There's a process of production, commodities are produced, and these commodities are then sold on the market for money. There's also extra money profits that are generated in this process of production which are realised by the capitalist. And that money may be reinvested into a new cycle. But this is the basic circuit of capital that Marx talks about. Almost by definition, when you're talking about crisis, you're talking about a breakdown in this process of circulation. For whatever reason, goods go unsold, investments go unmade. And predominantly you're talking about these processes here not taking place. The capitalists are only able to sell their goods, or having sold their goods, they decide for whatever reason not to invest in machinery or to hire labour. This is the form taken by crisis. Now, it's quite important to say that even at this very, very basic level, Marx has something quite interesting to say. Because if you look at the mainstream economic theories of his time, and sadly still in our time, the kind of mainstream theories that try to describe crisis are completely divorced from reality, from the real world. There are major sort of theories of mainstream economics that completely exclude, for example, the concept of money. Money plays no role. Or completely ignore the role of capitalist firms. Or often completely ignore the whole concept of production. And similarly, in Marx's day, there was an economic common sense that was developing that was completely cut from reality. One of the most important elements of this, that's criticised both by Keynes, but much earlier than that by Marx, is the idea of Say's law, named after a person called Say. And Say's law argues that you can't have a generalised crisis produced by unsold goods, by a glut of unsellable goods, because every sale is also a purchase, and every purchase is a sale. In other words, if I'm a capitalist and I want to buy a factory and so on in order to produce, I'm also buying stuff as well as producing stuff to sell. And because of this, there can never be more production than there's demand. There can never be generalised overproduction of commodities. So you can never have this situation in which this circuit of capital breaks down. Marx, in his economic writings, among other things, points out that under capitalism, inherent in this circuit of capital is a possibility of capitalist crisis. The mere existence of money within this circuit means that having sold your commodities as a capitalist that you produce, there's absolutely no guarantee that you'll go off and invest. You can simply squirrel away the money and decide to postpone your investment. The circuit can break down. There's no guarantee that a commodity buyer might choose to buy a commodity just because it's being produced. In other words, a capitalist economy is an economy that evolves in time, it involves money, it involves a circuit, and this circuit can break down. So this is the context in which Marx describes crisis happening. But Marx argues that to acknowledge that the capitalist circuit can break down is to do no more than simply say there's an abstract possibility of crisis built into capitalism. To quote Marx, he says that this possibility of breakdown explains the possibility of crises, but by no means their actual occurrence. It is the elementary form of crisis. To explain the crisis on the basis of this is to explain the crisis by the crisis. In other words, it's not enough to say the circuit of capitalism can break down and that's what causes a crisis. We have to talk about the processes that drive the capitalist system again and again into crisis. We have to look at concrete processes that drive the system into crisis. Now I want to say a couple more things at this point about theories of crisis. The first is this idea that you can't simply say that crisis is just overproduction or underconsumption of goods, is a challenge to a large number of Marxists who want to root the theory of crisis in the idea of underconsumption, and the idea of insufficient purchasing power driving the system into crisis. For Marx, this is insufficient, because by definition, if you have a crisis, people are not buying all the goods that are produced. You have to say something a bit more than that. If you want to explain crisis, you have to explain why it is that the goods that are produced by capitalism are not absorbed by the market. You have to explain it. The second thing that I want to say is that if you look at Marxist writing on crisis, one of the tendencies is to say, well, yes, you have different factors driving the system into crisis, but they vary so much between different crises that you can't focus on a singular factor driving the system into crisis. If you look at the crisis of the 1970s, or the crisis of the early 1980s, or the crisis of 2008, 2009, they take very different forms, very different expressions of crisis, and therefore even searching for a general theory is pointless. Now I think there's an element of truth to that. We always have to be concrete when we look at the patterns of crisis and how they evolve and develop. But nonetheless, I think you can point to general factors that you can identify. And I want to talk in particular about two factors that drive the capitalist economy into crisis, that are actual, if you like, causative elements that aren't just talking about the abstract possibility of crisis, but which repeatedly throw the system into crisis. The first one which I'm going to talk about, which I think is absolutely foundational to a coherent Marxist account of crisis, is what Marx called the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It's an enormous mouthful. What did Marx mean by the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and why is it important to us? And Marx felt this theory was extraordinarily important to him. He argues in one of his writings, it's the most fundamental law of all political economy. And elsewhere he talks about it as the greatest triumph over the asses of all previous political economy. He clearly thought it was a tremendously important discovery that he made. So why do we care about a falling rate of profit? We care about it because profit is the lifeblood of the capitalist system. If we look at the circuit of capital, which I've illustrated here, why does the capitalist engage in production? Not simply to produce commodities, but to produce commodities that they can sell for a profit. The whole basis of capitalist production is to expand capital. In other words, capital, this money that's harnessed by the capitalist, is set in motion in order to expand. To expand by generating profit. And Marx argues that this profit generated under capitalism is generated is generated precisely by a process of exploitation inside the workplace in which value is pumped out of what Marx calls living labour. In other words, the labour of people who work for a capitalist for a wage inside a capitalist workplace. The rate of profit, Marx argued, is simply the ratio between the amount of profit that the capitalist receives and the amount that they have to invest in order to get it. It's the return on their investment. In other words, the rate of profit, a misunderstanding of the capitalist system, is the rate of expansion of capital. It's the rate at which the capital invested by the capitalist is growing. To give you a crude example, if you're a capitalist and your rate of profit is 50%, I can simply squirrel away my money at the end of 2 years, and after 2 years I can double the size of my investment. If my rate of profit falls to 10%, it will take me 10 years. If it falls to 1%, it will take me 100 years of just squirreling my money to be able to double my investment. So the rate of profit is an absolutely crucial variable from a capitalist perspective. Now, Marx argued, as I say, that it's in the process of production that capital expands. It's from squeezing living labour, exploiting living labour, that capitalists generate what Marx calls surplus value and profit. I'm not going to go through the mechanism in detail, There are other meetings of Marxism which will explore this in more detail. But Marx argued that what you do as a capitalist is you don't just hire living labour. The capitalists will hire both labour power, but they'll also obtain the means of production, what Marx calls dead labour, machinery, raw materials, and so on and so forth, and set the two of them together in motion. In other words, for the worker to work, they have to have machinery, equipment, and so on. Marx's argument is that this dead labour doesn't in and of itself generate any new value. It represents an expenditure from the capitalist, and as it's used up, its value passes into the final product. So, in this very abstract picture, the capitalist makes neither a profit nor a loss on their dead labour. All of the profit originates from the hiring of labour power. Now, if that's true, and I think there are strong reasons for believing that is the case under capitalism, rationally, we'd expect what capitalists would want to do is hire a greater and greater mass of living labour and get rid of this dead labour, which is simply an albatross around their neck. You'd expect, rationally, capitalists to be replacing machinery with human beings, endlessly. More and more people, fewer and fewer machines, because that's where they get their profits out of. In practice, we know that's not how capitalism works. Capitalism, in fact, the trend is in the opposite direction, towards automation, towards kicking people out of their jobs and replacing them with machinery. And this, for Marx, is driven by the process of competition inherent within the capitalist system itself. The capitalist is not an isolated capitalist, they're a capitalist in competition with their rivals, and in order to compete effectively with your rivals, you have to seek to cheapen the commodities you're producing, to produce them more efficiently, more productively. And the best way of doing that is replacing living labour with machinery, with dead labour. Not only is this the most efficient way of increasing the productivity of labour, capitalists are in fact compelled to do this. Just think for a moment what it would mean if you were a car manufacturer to try to produce using equipment from 50 or 60 years ago. You'd very, very rapidly be driven out of business by your rivals who could produce more efficiently. So this process of accumulating more and more dead labour is written into the fabric of the capitalist system. To fail to, as Marx put it, accumulate capital, to grab more and more dead labour, to drive some of your profits back into accumulating dead labour, is to be driven out of business as a capitalist. In other words, decisions that are perfectly rational from an individual capitalist point of view to replace living labour with dead labour lead to overall trends within the capitalist system that are irrational. And the most important for Marx is the falling rate of profit. Because as in relative terms what you do is you drive out living labour and replace it with dead labour, what you find as a capitalist is you're investing more and more in machinery, in equipment, in raw materials, in plant, in computers, and so on and so forth, in order to grab a certain portion of profit. The overall rate of profit tends to fall. Even if the mass of profits is growing a little bit, the rate of profit, the return on your investment, will tend to fall over long periods of time. And the reason why Marx felt this was such an important law of political economy was it seemed to be an expression of the capitalist system falling on its own contradictions. It's the very process of accumulating more and more capital which begins to undermine the accumulation of capital. Because as your rate of profit falls, your capacity to expand is reduced. Your profit relative to your investment is falling, your scope to expand in future is reduced. And it causes a profound crisis for the capitalist system because it begins to undermine accumulation. In other words, Marx could argue that in this law he discovered a mechanism of self-undermining accumulation. The more you accumulate, the more you undermine future accumulation. This drives the system into crisis. Now, almost immediately after he's developed this law of the falling rate of profit in Capital, Marx then points out a whole series of what he calls counteracting tendencies that push in the opposite direction. I'm not going to go through all the counteracting tendencies. One is that the capitalists can squeeze workers harder. They can exploit us harder, squeeze more profit out of living labour. That's the first mechanism. The second one is that as this process of accumulation goes on, one of the consequences is that commodities become cheaper. This is why capitalists invest, to make labour more productive and make commodities cheaper. One of the commodities that might become cheaper is the means of production themselves. And if the means of production become cheaper, hypothetically it can restore profitability. The capitalists can get their equipment, their plant, their computers and so on for less value and less money. Now some Marxists, in thinking about crisis, see the law of the falling rate of profit on the one hand and the counteracting tendencies on the other hand as if they're sort of equal and opposite forces. They're like an angel and a devil sitting on your shoulder, whispering into your ear. One of them trying to drag profit rates down to hell, one of them pushing up to heaven, and it all becomes a bit indeterminate and uncertain what happens as a consequence of this. I disagree with that way of approaching it. I want to argue that the most powerful tendency, I'll show you some data in a moment which demonstrates this, under normal times is for profit rates to fall under capitalism. And the reason is simple if we look at the two main counteracting tendencies. First of all, if you think about the exploitation of living labour, this has been important in boosting profitability at certain points in time. It was very important in the early 1990s in countries like Britain. It's been very important almost everywhere post-2008. Pretty much the only policy that the capitalists have been able to agree on post-2008 is squeeze workers harder to try and restore profitability. But there are limits to this process of squeezing. There are always limits to how hard you can squeeze living labour. Not only are there limits, but as you begin to replace living labour with dead labour, the impact of squeezing living labour becomes more limited. So that's the first counteracting tendency. It's important, but there are limits to how far you can go with it. The second counteracting tendency is actually more important, the cheapening of means of production. Now this can indeed drive up profitability, but there are also problems it introduces into the system. The most obvious one is this. Let's say that I'm a capitalist who engages in the print industry, that's what I do. And someone tells me, we've invented this new printing press that does exactly what your printing press does, but it will only cost you £1 million. That's fantastic, unless I've just paid £100 million for an old printing press that's the equivalent of what the new one does. In which case I have a massive sunk investment that I still have to repay all the bank loans on and so on and so forth. Whilst all my rivals who join the market later in time can take advantage of this new technology that undercuts me, that drives down, in fact, my profitability. So even this counteracting tendency can also have a negative impact on profits for some capitalists. It's an enormous form of disruption within the capitalist system. Now, and finally, in terms of the counteracting tendencies, even when they do have the impact of raising profit rates, but the impact across the capitalist system tends to be to spur a new wave of investment, often in very, very capital-intensive means of production, beyond what was currently in existence. So even if it does, in the short term, raise profitability, it tends to then create the same process that lowered profitability in the first place, the more rapid accumulation of capital. So that's not to say that profit rates can't rise in the short term, but the point I want to make is that these processes tend to be most effective, not in the ordinary day-to-day functioning of capitalism, but precisely in moments of crisis. Because it's in moments of crisis that you tend to get the depreciation of capital on an extraordinary scale. Remember when the crisis in 2008 broke, one of the impacts in Britain was that a venerable old retail chain, Woolworths, went bust. And the entire chain was sold for £10, I think, in the end, plus some debt. But for the capitalist who survives the crisis and gets their hands on the warehouses, the unsold goods, the cash registers, the computer equipment and so on, this is hugely profitable. Think about those kind of processes magnified on a system-wide scale. Crisis, through destroying capital, redistributing capital at a fraction of its real value, is precisely the moment at which these counteracting forces can drive up profitability. And alongside this process, you get the destruction of bad debts, you get a squeezing of workers, which tends to happen in crisis, and so on. In other words, crisis is the bitter medicine which tends to restore the system, at least for a moment, back to health again. And there's very, very good evidence for that. If you look at the crisis that erupted from the early 1930s and ran right through the process of destruction of the Second World War, that 15-year process from 1930 to 1945 marked a huge destruction of capital, but it also paved the way for the most sustained boom the capitalist system has ever experienced. In other words, crisis itself is what allows the system to drive forwards. Now, a final point about this falling rate of profit. One of the debates among Marxists is, should we interpret this as a cyclical phenomenon, which explains the business cycle, the cycle of boom and bust? Or are we talking about a long-term tendency within the capitalist system, long periods of falling profitability? I think if we want to take it seriously, we have to talk about the falling rate of profit as both. In other words, you have a falling rate of profit during the economic cycle, which leads to a tendency of boom and bust. But at the same time, if the crisis can't fully cure the capitalist system of its problems, then the profit rate will continue to fall over multiple cycles. You can have long-term tendencies and patterns within the capitalist system. I'm going to argue in a moment that one of the shifts within the capitalist system historically has been towards the falling rate of profit becoming a much more long-term, if you like, secular phenomena, and not simply a short-term cyclical phenomena. I'll return to that point in a second. Now, alongside the falling rate of profit and the counteracting tendencies, the other factor that's crucial in explaining crisis is the way in which the financial system, the credit system, and finance more generally develops under capitalism. There's a tendency among some Marxists to see finance, credit, the banks and so on as something that exists as some kind of parasitic outgrowth on the edge of capitalism somewhere. This is not really Marx's approach. Marx believes that these financial processes are written into the very fabric of capitalism, from a very, very early, right from the outset really, under capitalism. And Marx describes credit and finance, to quote Marx, as the most potent means of driving capitalist production beyond its own limits, and one of the most effective vehicles of crisis and swindle. So it drives capitalism beyond its limits, but it leads to crisis as well. What does Marx mean by this? At its most simple, finance can drive capitalism beyond its limits by allowing those capitalists who have money but no particular outlet to invest it in their own business to lend their money via a bank to another capitalist who might want to make an investment but has no money to do so. The credit system becomes a way of redistributing value through the system in this manner. So it allows capitalists who don't actually have their own reserves of cash to expand and then pay back through interest payments out of a portion of their profits. So it drives the capitalist system beyond its limits. And this process is mediated through the banks and increasingly today through what's called the shadow banking system. People know what the shadow banking system is? The shadow banking system is organisations that really do the kind of things that banks do, but they're not regulated like banks. Money market funds, hedge funds, and so on and so forth. So these are also a really big part of the financial system. But as well as driving the system beyond its limits, this process of financialisation of capitalism, or the process of the growth of finance within capitalism, also generates new forms of instability. As the process of accumulation accelerates during a boom, suddenly there may be shortages of capital, driving up interest rates, causing huge problems for people who borrow because if interest rates go up, you suddenly find repayments are going up. Similarly, as doubts begin to develop about the prospects of the capitalist system, suddenly debts are called in. when there's a boom going on, everyone's happy to lend money with very little security and guarantees and so on. The moment there's a whiff of crisis, 5 minutes, okay, we need a little bit longer. The moment crisis seems to be developing, debts are called in. And people struggle to pay these debts, it throws certain capitalists to the wall. In other words, finance becomes a mechanism for coordinating the cycle of boom and bust. Things like the movement of interest rates, the way in which debts are called in at moments of crisis, can accelerate and sharpen this crisis of boom and bust. There are two other things I want to say about this process of finance. The first is that credit relations are not just relations between capitalists. Banks and shadow banking as well, shadow banks as well, don't just want to borrow money off capitalists. They also will harness reserves of cash from workers, from idle rich people who just happen to be sitting on pots of cash, from any source they can find. And similarly, people who borrow money are not just capitalists. These credit rate relations begin to penetrate every area of society. We all have bank loans, or student loans, or mortgages, or pension funds. We're all drawn into a system of finance. Often in quite antagonistic ways. I don't know about you, but I feel quite antagonistic towards my bank a lot of the time. They're trying to screw me over, and I'm trying to screw them over. This is how it works. But there are these antagonistic credit relations that permeate the capitalist system, which also feature in moments of crisis. Think about how the subprime mortgage crisis in 2007-2008, among poor Americans who could never really afford to take out the mortgages, but had mortgages foisted upon them, because they couldn't find anyone else to sell mortgages to in the US. Think about how these people were central to how the crisis erupted in 2007-2008. Secondly, these credit relations, as they develop, unlock broader spheres of speculation. Traditionally, things like stock markets, but today we talk about financial derivatives, hedge funds, and so on. And what these markets represent is paper claims over future wealth, which people expect to be produced under the capitalist system, which then trade within capitalist markets according to their own laws of motion. A share certificate entitles me to a share of dividends, and I might hold a share certificate hoping to get some of those dividends, but I might also buy it for purely speculative reasons, because I think the price is going to go up. And I might then sell it on to someone else in order to realise those gains. This leads to areas of pure speculation, particularly in moments of boom, which can then unravel and come crashing down again. In other words, finance introduces new forms of instability into the system. Okay, moving on, because I haven't got very long left. I want to say something a little bit about how crisis has developed historically, and how we should understand this general Marxist theory of crisis today. And here I am going to show a few graphs, if I may. The first point I want to make is really about the patterns of profitability. These are from they're the same as are published in Michael Roberts' recent book. I can point people towards the books and so on. If they want, this is also on Michael Roberts' website, which is a fantastic website. But what he's looking at is the US rate of profit. There's two different measures. Don't worry for now, I don't have time to explain the two different measures. They follow roughly the same pattern. The point I want to make about this pattern of profitability is it follows precisely this kind of cyclical pattern. There are booms and there are busts, but also that there are long-term patterns developing within the capitalist system. The period from, sorry, I've done a little table that summarises it. The post-war period up to 1981 is a period of a long decline of profitability in economies such as the US. The period from 1982 to 2007 is a period of relatively stable profitability, rising a little bit in the US case, but not very much. And then the period of 2008 is a period in which profits collapse again, and they rebound a little bit later, but not to a kind of level seen in the 1950s and 60s, not to these kind of boom levels of profitability. There appears to be a long-term development of profitability in the capitalist system, taking place over many, many cycles. And I want to argue this is tied to broader changes to the capitalist system. It's another graph, slightly messy looking graph, sorry about that. But what you get from this is just looking at essentially the rate of growth of the American economy throughout the 20th century. And what you get is three distinct phases in the development of the American economy. A phase from 1900 through to 1945, where you have these very, very sharp, explosive periods of growth, followed by very, very sharp recessions, often characterized by extraordinarily high levels of unemployment and huge levels of bankruptcy if you look at the data for some of these recessions. What you get in the post-war period is a long boom taking place, but at relatively low levels of growth. It's called the long boom. It's not the high boom, it's a long boom. It takes place over 30 years, but at relatively lower levels of growth than were experienced in the very, very sharp booms in the pre-war period. And then you get another period here from about 1991 where these processes of moderation go to an extraordinary level. How do we explain this? And I think, and this is the last part, I'm going to spend 5 minutes on this and then I'll wind up. I think we can explain it through looking at the long-term changes to the capitalist economy during the 20th century. Now, let me explain the change and I'll say something more about why I think this is important. The first change is that if you look at the structure of capitalism throughout the 20th century, what we've seen is an enormous growth of the units of capital. The example I always give in meetings, if you look at Walmart, the biggest company in the world by revenue, it has an annual turnover the same as the GDP of Norway. In other words, you have giant multinational firms the size of medium-sized Scandinavian countries. This process is going. This is some of the data I found which kind of illustrates the trend. It looks at the share of the largest 100 firms in manufacturing in the UK and US. You see that the top 100 firms play a bigger and bigger role in dominating these markets. Now you might ask what's happened after 1970. I've got some data just from the US. Some of the data is quite complicated. If you look at the dotted blue line, it's a number of firms in the US economy that are publicly listed. So we're talking about big firms here. Unusually in terms of American history, it rises in this period, but from about 1998 it starts falling very sharply. And you get this shows the sort of level of concentration, it accelerates extremely sharply in this period. And what's happening here is the emergence of giant firms in the spheres of finance, in high-tech industries, and in retail in particular. Those are the three key areas of concentration and centralization of capital. So these are really important shifts in how capitalism is structured. One of the things that this does is it makes, as the late Mike Kidron used to argue, it makes late capitalism sclerotic. It bungs up the veins and arteries of capitalism. It means that the cost of crisis is allowing one of these behemoths, one of these giant firms to go under, potentially dragging the whole economy into slump. And paradoxically, it makes the process of crisis much less effective in curing the ills of the capitalist system. Because what it means is that the people running these economies have to allow these giant firms to go under. And they're extraordinarily reluctant to do so. And that then dovetails with another trend in the 20th century, the growing scale of the state in the economy. This is state expenditure for free economies, the spikes of the First and Second World War. But what you find is that after the war, state expenditure doesn't return to pre-war levels. And even in the latest phase, the so-called neoliberal phase, state expenditure doesn't fall to those kind of levels. The state is a far, far bigger player in the capitalist economy, with a whole series of really important implications. One of the most important is it links to this idea of larger firms, because the connections between the state and these giant firms become much stronger. And the idea of what's sometimes called too big to fail, that the state will step in to bail out giant firms if they're at risk of going under, becomes a dominant feature of crisis in this period. So this is a really important shift in the capitalist economy. It's this shift that means these tendencies are much more moderated, and that the rate of profit continues to fall through multiple cycles. In other words, crisis cannot perform its magic of raising profitability to the same extent that it used to in the early 20th century. So you get these long patterns of declining profit. Alongside this, you get the extraordinary growth of the financial sector that takes place here, which again amplifies the fragility of the capitalist system, but it also introduces new possibility of state intervention. If you look at the intervention that took place after 2008, these are direct bailouts of the economy in different countries. So the idea that the state has retreated from capitalist management is a myth. Of course, states intervened massively in the economy in 2008, 2009 to stimulate them, to buy out banking systems and so on. But in many ways, the dominant forms of intervention of the state in the economy in this period are not directly intervening to bail out firms, but are through central banks lowering interest rates to extraordinarily low levels, and through processes such as quantitative easing, in which central banks buy assets from banks to try and drive the economy forwards by stimulating, by expanding liquidity and stimulating the financial sector. The consequence of this was not to spur a new wave of accumulation after the crisis broke, but it was to create a certain level of dynamism in which firms that otherwise would have gone under through bankruptcy, what are often called zombie firms, could continue to lumber onwards in the wake of crisis, surviving its immediate impact, as well as fueling the growth of asset bubbles which have continued to develop within the world system. I'm completely running out of time. I have far too much material, so I think I need to finish on this point. But so let me say in summary, and we can have some discussion. I can come back to some of there's dozens of graphs I can show you.
Go on.
Yeah. Anyway, if you ask the right questions, you'll get to see the graphs. The point I want to make about all these shifts is that what they haven't done is they haven't eradicated this tendency toward boom and bust within capitalism. They haven't eradicated the crisis tendencies of capitalism. What they do is they move the crisis tendencies around. They submerge the crisis tendencies only for them to appear in new forms over long periods of time. Because paradoxically, the cost of not allowing crisis to take hold is that the problems continue to grow and fester deep within the capitalist system. The capitalist system remains barbaric and crisis-prone, even as the precise form taken by crisis and the mechanisms of crisis evolve within the capitalist system. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Joseph. And as you mentioned, I'm not sure if this mic is working. Okay, great. As you mentioned, that you'll be around afterwards for any other questions and comments, especially from the graphs. Okay, now we're going to spend about 2-3 minutes just getting to know each other. And this is kind of icebreaker. And the idea is that you talk to maybe the person who's next to you and either find out a bit about them or make a comment that you're interested in. So I'll give you about 3 minutes.
Hello. What are you filming for?
Basically, I'm coming from Manchester.
Okay.
To have
What, sorry?
just to listen.
Just to listen.
Yeah, yesterday I was last year I came to the festival.
Yep.
3 days.
Right.
Yeah, but this time it's not possible.
Yesterday. What do you do in Manchester?
Basically, I work in kitchen.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you want, you can stand up. You can introduce yourself if you choose to. And don't forget, if you don't want to be videoed by Jenny, please let us know. So who's going to be the first person who's going to kick things off? hello, the gentleman who's right in front of me and has got a white shirt. You've just risen your hand.
Yeah, that's me, sorry.
Well, you need the mic.
You need the mic?
Thanks. Right, thank you. So, yeah, let's congratulate Joseph on that. That was pretty good, quite honestly. Period being identified there. I'm not quite sure what it is. Like, people talk about neoliberalism as opposed to Keynesianism, which explains these changes in the 1980s. If there's a further change in the 1990s, it could be towards dominance of finance. I don't know. We can look at, but we want to identify some stages of neoliberalism, some precise things which have happened, which have been decisive in these changes. I'm not quite sure what they are. Finally, we seem to have a problem that, whereas previous periods of crises were sorted out by new technologies, new investment in new machines which restored the rate of profit, that hasn't really happened with the technological revolution. I don't quite know why. It's sort of promised to and it hasn't really worked. I don't quite know. Finally, whatever the crisis of capitalism, we've got an ecological crisis of global warming, which asks questions about this idea of economic determinism, that the economy is only so determinate, it has to exist within the context, within an ecological and biological context. Okay, can I leave it at that? That's fine, thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure this is working. It is, okay. There's a gentleman in front of me with a blue shirt, and then there's another gentleman with a blue shirt as well. I'm starting to feel like I'm in an auction or something. So if there's, I'll let the gentleman talk here with the blue shirt.
Right, thanks. Good turnout from the blue shirts today. The Irish will understand. I think the question that was raised about that it's not possible to get profits from machinery, or that they don't yield profits, I think that's important to understand, that that's dead labour. That is to say, the profits got from paying people essentially less than the value of what they produce. And it's only living labour, therefore, that produces that. What's happened in the past, the profit's already been got on that, if there was any to be got, and now the commodity is being sold on as means of production. So the more of that has to be wagered when in a cycle of production, you're going to have that to be measured, an enlarged expenditure to be measured against perhaps the same level of profit as existed before. So there's a decline because of that ratio. And that seems to be a long-term thing. Two things worried me about the way this has sometimes been discussed. One is that it strikes me as unlikely, or not really terribly persuasive, to use the question of the falling rate of profit to explain short-term cyclical movements, because the analogy I like is that it's like somebody like me getting older. You know, one of these days I'm going to get the flu and it's going to see me off, all right? Now, there's flus around the place all the time. When you're young and healthy, like a lot of good comrades here, you shake it off. When you're old and you're a bit ratchety, it does for you. The Grim Reaper comes. So, I mean, in a sense, as the cyclical rate of profit tends to decline, then, you know, sort of upsets take on a much more worrying aspect for the system. The other thing I wanted to ask about really was the notion, which I see emerges now in Michael Roberts and other people's discussion of these questions, which is that of fictitious profits. Because it seems to me that much of finance is rather like a poker game, you know. Whereas production is the creation of a surplus, finance, or much of it, is going to be a poker game. I go in with some money, you come in with some money, and so on. But we all leave the room at the end of the night. Some of us have lost and some of us have gained, but there's no new profit. So therefore the profits of the finance system must be therefore subtracted from the profits of the productive system. That's at least how it seems to me. I'd be interested in people's comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there's a gentleman next to you who wanted to make a comment. No? Okay. There's a gentleman over with the greens.
No, I was just bringing attention to the fellow in the blue shirt.
Okay. Another blue shirt.
Blue shirt.
So,
Yeah.
one blue shirt. Would you like to make a comment, please?
There's one here.
There's one here first.
Shall I, is that okay? Shall I start now?
Okay, another blue shirt.
Blue shirts are forming a football team. I'm going to take on red shirts if you want. Simon Oldtime Socialist Workers' Party. I think part of the problem for conventional kind of bourgeois economists and politicians is that it's exactly the question that they see profits as the difference between inputs and outputs, right? That's where they come from. They don't see it in terms of value and in terms of surplus value exploited from workers. So that means that conventional economists, even well onto the left and neo-Keynesians and all these people, they just see it in terms of inputs and outputs and profits. This idea that machinery doesn't produce profits is absolutely central to a Marxist understanding of the way in which we can talk about where surplus value comes from. And Joseph and other people probably want to talk about that. But I've got a challenge in terms of a graph. And I think it would, I don't know if you probably haven't got it, but it's quite an interesting one, because if you do a graph of rates of profits or state expenditure as a proportion of GDP, or the amount of money spent on council housing or invested in other state services, if you draw a graph of the 20th century with those, then you overlay it with who's in government, they don't actually synchronise very well. In other words, the political implications of this whole idea of crisis being deeply embedded in the system means that actually a conventional government isn't in control of it. Conventional governments cannot control the rate of profit, and this has massive implications for anybody who's on the left, anybody who's a socialist. And if you look at some of the things that have been written now in terms of postmodernism by Paul Mason, and a book that's just come out by, I think, Aran Bastani, Labour Party orientated theorists trying to get their heads around what's happening in the economy. And it seems to me that I don't think they are here, but they should have been here to get this kind of angle on what the relationship is between the political system and what's possible for you to do within certain limits and the underlying kind of dynamics of the capitalist system. This is going to be a really, really dramatic kind of thing for us to be dealing with if and when we get a radical Labour government in, and whether or not it is going to be able to deal with the sort of things that are at the root of the problems in terms of capitalist crisis.
Can I thank you? There's a gentleman with another blue shirt. Thank you. Who's next to Jenny?
Cheers, thanks. It's just a question, really. You had the graph on the wall with the where profits come from with the labour power and the means of production. How does the cost of the raw materials fit in? Because they'll need raw materials as well. Because like factory I work in, when they're busy, when we want to get product out the door, suddenly the cost of the raw materials, which is like mainly from hydrocarbon industry goes up, and then when things are crap and they're fighting to sell us stuff. So I wonder where that fits in as well.
Thank you very much. There's another blue shirt.
I'll watch them.
Sorry. Would you like to? Yeah.
Okay. I thought this was great.
Send it back.
My eyes aren't working. Does this? Oh, okay, good. I wanted to ask something regarding debt, because it seems to me, so what I wanted to ask was how is debt, and you talked about it being really sewn out into the nation, you know, now over the past few decades, as a very early thing that people are introduced to, you know, tied to very deliberately, it seems to me. How is that, when most of it seems to cost money? You talk about student loans now, this is only intuitive, it's not a data-based understanding of it, but my kind of intuitive understanding of that, my belief would be that actually they're not getting that money back. It's mainly, a lot of it must be defaulting. Certainly, yeah, well, so anyway, so my belief is a lot of it is defaulting. Definitely when it comes to the gutting of the, well, what we call the welfare system, the insurance system as it actually is, but the gutting of that system is definitely costing money. So it's reducing profit, it's reducing spending power, it's reducing the consumption of commodity. So so two questions if I can, as a result of that. How is that debt harnessed into profit? And also, is there not also a non-economic agenda there to actually just produce an incredibly large section of society who are so poor that their daily lives are driven by subsistence considerations, by contingency living, so that they don't have the capacity to actually agitate, to challenge, to organise, and to change and overthrow. Because I think now we're in a point in time where poverty doesn't seem to be producing profit, but seems to be just producing the incapacity to change things. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now there was a few hands over this side and I kind of lost track. The gentleman who's in the grey shirt, followed by the gentleman in the red shirt on this side. I think there would be more people.
Yes, I just wanted to talk, somebody mentioned the environment, and I think one of the ways that capitalist economists really talk about the environment is as an externality, and they seem to think that the Earth system and the capitalist economy are sort of distinct, and that the Earth system is some good that can be abused or used as they see fit. Whereas if you look at, say, Marx's simple reproduction schema, where all of the profits are consumed by the capitalists instead of being reinvested into more means of production, that sort of presupposes a cycle where the living labour is replaced, so older workers are replaced by younger workers, where the means of production, whether that's materials, can be extracted again, and that means that their idea of the rate of profit tends to overstate things if they are destroying the environment, which is what they're doing. So I think their vision of how well things are going is a much more positive one than what they actually are. But my real point was that at the moment you talked about different forms of crisis, and I think the crisis fighting mechanism over the past 10 years of ultra low or emergency low interest rates has continued. Interest rates have barely crept back up in the core capitalist economies. But we're now expecting a new downturn, having never really recovered. And I think trying to think about the consequences of the UK economy, where the interest rate never goes above 0.5%. People are trying to buy annuities with their pension in their old age, and they're finding they can't get very much each year for annuities. So these new forms of crisis can be sort of sneaking up on us over a much longer time frame than the kind of dramatic crisis U-turn where firms are closing down because they've simply run out of cash.
Thank you. I think we've got just a little time for about, I think there's about 4 people speaking this side. One gentleman here, and then the final person will be...
Is Joe going to get time to come back?
Yes, yes he will do, but I think that we're going to have to maybe...
Yeah, I'd like to know what Joe thinks about the... I mean, capitalism relies on competition, and we've seen in this country they've done away with the Monopolies Commission, which is a form of state interference that helped capitalism, if you like. There seemed to be an attempt with quantitative easing to keep the flow of money going, which failed because they gave the money to the banks instead of giving it to us, and we would have spent it, and that would have kept the flow of money going. There's a built-in obsolescence in all our computers and iPhones and all the rest of it, which gives those firms a monopoly, and the bailing out of big firms in America again means there isn't the competition that capitalism needs, and we're heading for something far more right-wing economy than a capitalist economy, because we've seen what happens when you have private monopolies. I wonder what Joe thinks of that.
Okay, now unfortunately we've run out of time, so I'm going to ask Joseph to sum up in 10 minutes. And then if there's other questions and comments that people had and we couldn't get to, perhaps you can meet with Joseph and talk with him further after we finish the session. We're finishing at 5:30.
Yeah, thanks for that discussion. As ever, you get a myriad sort of really interesting questions at these meetings. I won't be able to come back on every single one of them, I suspect. But I'll do my best with the time I have at my disposal. First of all, just to clarify, when I say that capitalists don't get any money for machinery, of course, from an individual capitalist perspective, it makes perfect sense to invest in machinery because you're in rivalry with other capitalists and you want to undercut them. My point is that across the capitalist system as a whole, new value is not generated by using up machinery, raw materials, and what I call dead labour. Marx is central to Marx's analysis in Volume 1 of Capital. I'll talk more about this in my meeting in Capital tomorrow. But the source of new value is the exploitation of living labour, and it creates a certain pool of potential profits that rival capitalists can grab. The share that you grab of that pool of potential profit would largely be determined by the scale of your investment. So from an individual perspective, of course, it does make perfect sense to invest in machinery, computers and so on. Someone asked, where does raw material fit into this picture? It's part of the means of production. It plays a similar role to that. Although because it's fast circulating, unlike machinery, that can also have very, very important implications. So people have talked about the potential for catastrophic climate change. If that starts feeding into the price of raw material, it can actually have quite profound impacts on capitalist production. But there's lots of phenomena like that we have to talk about. Secondly, in terms of someone asked at the beginning, well, what kind of period of capitalism are we really in at the moment? I would characterise the period we're in like this. I would say that the period is one in which the units that make up the system are incomparably larger than they were 50 or 100 years ago. We're in a period in which the state remains a central player in the economy, although the mechanisms of state intervention have changed and evolved over time. And I'd say that we're in a period in which the capitalist economy is heavily financialized. I didn't really get a chance to discuss this, but if you look at the growth of finance that's taken place really since the 1980s, it's been on an absolutely staggering scale. And part of the argument I would want to make about this period is that this growth of finance, financial assets, debt, credit, speculative asset classes and so on, is not simply an accident, it's a consequence precisely of the long period of low profitability we've been in. Profit rates bottom out in roughly 1982. It's precisely from 1982 onwards that you start to get the massive growth of financial assets on a global scale, particularly focused on Wall Street, the City of London and so on. But now today, certainly post-2007, on a global scale, you see these patterns. Now, what is the function of this massive growth of finance? Partly it's a case of capitalists looking at the low levels of profitability and thinking, where can I get a quick return for the money I have? And often financial speculation is quite attractive. But secondly, this has the effect of both creating an enormous sort of froth of dynamism on the surface of capitalism, but not just for 1 or 2 years, but really for a whole period of time, despite these low levels of profitability. And that's one of the key features within the capitalist system. Now, one of the consequences of that process of financialization is that when the crisis erupts in 2007-2008, it breaks out first in the sphere of mortgages, but then spreads through the financial system. It appears like it's a financialized crisis, but it's ultimately rooted in the low levels of profitability. And part of the reason that resolving the crisis has been so difficult is precisely because these levels of profitability were low and have remained low. Even after the crisis of 2007-2008, if you look at the US data, and actually if you look at the global data as well, there was a big spike in bankruptcies around 2007. Very, very rapidly it returned to very low levels. It's not true that we're seeing a mass clear out of the capitalist system in which unprofitable firms go to the wall. What you get from about 2009-2010 is huge growth of so-called zombie companies kept alive by low interest rates, quantitative easing and so on, that kept the system ticking over, that prevented a full-scale clear out of the capitalist system. This being the case, the system relies extraordinarily heavily on low interest rates, quantitative easing and so on for the dynamism that it retains today. Not simply in the global north, but this is now true of economies such as China. No one asked me about China, but I'm going to show you the graph anyway. There's some extraordinary data emerging from China looking at how it's a different face of the crisis, but it's the same pattern Marx identified of this rapid accumulation. Rates of accumulation in China, by the way, are far greater than ever achieved during the British Industrial Revolution, far greater than achieved anywhere in the long boom. Something like 50% of output reinvested every year for a period of time. But what's a consequence of this? Sharp accumulation, sharp decline in profitability. What's the response of the Chinese government when the crisis breaks? To do exactly what the US Federal Reserve, Britain and other countries have done historically over the last 30 or 40 years. Unleash a wave of credit to drive the Chinese economy forward, which is what's been happening in this period, without restoring profitability. The profit crisis in China, though China is not in slump or recession or anything like that, its rate of growth is much lower than it was, but this long-term crisis of profitability will have a profound impact on China. The amount of capital you have to put forwards to get a unit of growth in China has grown astronomically, and alongside it there's been an extraordinary growth of debt, credit, finance, shadow banking and so on within the Chinese economy. Closer to home, what you find again and again is the paradox of people trying to manage the economy in this period of relative stagnation. And it appears to me more and more that the price of trying to generate even a mini boom in the capitalist system today is that you have to allow financial instability to explode. You take the case of America. America, has been doing relatively well compared to Europe and Japan based on the Trump tax cuts and so on and so forth. The moment the US Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates again to try and restore normality, you start to see panic on a global scale, with money flowing back to the US, undermining the growth that's taking place elsewhere. And today, as a US boom begins to peter out, What you're getting is the US Federal Reserve saying, actually, we may start lowering interest rates in America again. What's the consequence of lowering interest rates in America? It promotes credit expansion, it promotes financial instability, and it isn't a long-term way of solving and addressing the fundamental problems of low profitability in the American economy. Ruling classes are forced to choose between financial instability or extraordinarily low or negative levels of growth. It's a paradox that's rooted in this long-term fall in profitability, and it shows really the fundamental contradictions within the capitalist system today. That doesn't mean that the capitalist system is going to disappear, it's going to collapse of its own accord. That certainly wasn't Marx's position. The capitalist system was something that we'll have to challenge and over for ourselves, but it's a shocking indictment of the capitalist system that its performance in the current period is so awful. And I think what we should say, I'll finish on this point. What we should say is that the instability unleashed by 2008 is far from over, and we have to continue to mobilise people against this barbaric system and start to fight for a non-capitalist, anti-capitalist alternative. Thank you.